Hello and welcome to another lecture of the course Aquaculture. Today we are going to talk about types of feeders used in aquaculture. Feeding, when you are doing aquaculture, then we all know that feeding is one of the most important part and essential part of the aquaculture process, which is a continuous practice, which you have to do every day. And just having the right type of food that you want to provide to the fish, or whether we are talking of live food or artificial food that you have to provide to the fish. If you are having that with all the details that we have discussed in the previous lecture, if the food is at your hand, then you need to provide the food to the fish in the pond. So that process, the feeding of the fish, is a very important daily activity at fish farms. That not only requires considerable time, but you know manpower also. To facilitate efficient and consistent feeding, aquaculture facilities utilize a variety of specialized feeding equipment and technologies. It all depends on that what kind of aquaculture practice do you have, what kind of species are you culturing, what is the scale of aquaculture practice, whether you are doing it at a very small scale or at a large scale, commercial scale. uh, this is the main factor that what kind of feeding method, what kind of feeding practice you shall be adopting, and what kind of inputs, in terms of economic inputs, which feeding method, which feeding type, or whether you need to do it with a large number of manpower in order to provide the fish and the required food, or you need something else. So when you have small farms, feeding by using labor or manpower is relatively easy, and that is economical also. But if your aquaculture system is at commercial scale, then you need to have special feeders, which automatically dispense the appropriate quantity of feed to the fish in the pond. The selection of an appropriate feeding system, that depends on many factors, such as the species being cultured, that's what I just told you, the feeding behavior, what is the feeding behavior and feeding habit of the fishes that you have stocked in your pond, the physical layout and constraints of the aquaculture facility, what is the accessibility of all margins of the pond, and how things can move, whether you can have some kind of vehicle that can move, you have that kind of facility, or you just have very traditional earthen burns where moving vehicles is not possible. So whatever kind of facilities and kind of resources you are having, based on that, the appropriate feeding system can be decided. Factors like feed type, particle size, and delivery method. Feed type, particle size, what is the particle size, what is the feed type, and what is the delivery method must also be considered to ensure the feed is accessible and palatable to the species that you have stocked in the pond. Proper feeder management is crucial to maintain water quality. That we have discussed many a times, that there should not be feed wastage, and that should not affect the water quality. Minimize feed waste, maintain water quality, minimize feed waste, and promote optimal growth and survival of cultured organisms. Feeding methods based on the level of automation and labor involved. What are different feeding methods that are there in practice based on automation, level of automation and labor involved? Manual feeding. I told you that if it is manageable, then it includes broadcasting the feeds into the pond as well as placing the feeds into the floating frames or trays that we have discussed in other lectures also. Feeding trays are used either to monitor actual feeding or to serve as feeding areas. This is one general photograph that has been shown, how broadcasting is done and how trays are used. Mechanical feeding. Here we use automated equipment to dispense feed at programmed intervals, whatever the frequency you decide, or in response to sensor data. Sometimes we place sensors for getting the feed by the fish. If there is a movement, fish-like movement, or if fish moves near that, then feed can be dispensed. Reduces the need for manual labor and allows for more consistent and efficient feeding when everything is mechanized. Mechanical feeders can be time-based, demand-based, or controlled by environmental parameters. It depends on what is your requirement. Allows the precise feed management and reduced feed wastage. Beneficial for large-scale intensive aquaculture system. That is, in fact, almost necessary for large-scale intensive aquaculture systems, because you need to dispense feed at regular intervals periodically, and arranging labor many times a day for dispensing food or for providing food, correct amount of food, which should be palatable and accessible to all the fishes, that becomes difficult. Examples are belt feeders, demand feeders, automatic feeding barges. Demand feeders. So, demand feeders, as the name indicates, that depends on the appetite or demand of food by the fishes. So, when demanded, fish will get food. These feeders are easy to install and operate. They are very easy. The level of the feed in the container is a good indication of the condition of the fish, whether they are consuming it or not. In demand feeders, the fish touch the rod connected to a plug or plate in the bottom of the feed hopper. This plug normally closes the hopper so that feed does not fall out. When moved by the movement of the bait rod, a small quantity of feed is released. Very simple. When it is moved, then plug is removed, feed comes down, and when it is not moving, the feed is not coming into the pond. Demand feeders can be divided into two main groups, namely bait rod or pendulum type feeders and submerged plate type feeders. Pendulum type feeders are not suitable for young fish, since young fish will not be able to move the pendulum, and when pendulum will not be moved, feed will not come down. Outlet size of these feeders, pendulum type, should be adjusted carefully, otherwise uncontrolled pouring of feed can be caused by the spontaneous touching of the fish. So, whichever demand feeder we are using, these points should be taken into consideration carefully. The submerged plate type demand feeders are controlled not by the contact of the fish, but the removal of all feed from the plate. If all feed has been removed, then more feed will come. Submerged plate type of feeder can be operated by small fish as well. These are some generalized diagrams of demand feeders. Pendulum type demand feeder and plate type demand feeder. Here you can see there is a plate at number 7, and the generalized structure of the plate type demand feeder. Automatic feeders are sophisticated feeding devices that dispense feed automatically based on pre-programmed settings or in response to specific triggers. That is your choice, that what you want to program the feeders, how you want to program the feeders. Automatic feeders can be classified according to their energy supply as being electric, pneumatic, and hydraulic type. So, depending on what type of energy supply you are going to use, they are named as electric, pneumatic and hydraulic type. A feeding machine or an automatic feeder consists of 4 major components. What are these? A feed container, which we often call as hopper, a mechanism for feed distribution, an electrical power supply, and control unit for starting and stopping the distribution mechanism. This is a generalized diagram of automatic feeder that has been shown along with its components. Distribution mechanism in automatic feeders. Many mechanisms for feed distribution are available. Some important types are described below. How the feed gets distributed in automatic feeders: by screw, vibrator, cell wheel, rotating disc with a scraper. A screw allows a specific batch of feed to be dispensed for every rotation. I will show you the photograph, then you can understand it better. The screw is installed under a hopper from which it is filled. The amount dispensed per unit time is related to screw diameter, design of the screw, the speed of rotation, the degree of filling and the angle of the screw. How vibrator works? A plate that vibrates may be used to distribute a volume of feed. When the almost horizontally fixed plate starts to vibrate, the feed on the plate will start falling down from the edges. One method of getting vibration is to attach a weight to one side of a vertically fixed shaft that rotates. When the shaft rotates, there will be imbalance in the shaft and in the plate fixed to it. Another method is to use electromagnet with an anchor fixed by a leaf or coil spring. When the electricity is turned on, the anchor is dragged towards the magnet by a varying magnetic field, making the whole vibrator shake. Slope on the feeding plate causes the feed to be, to come down, to fall down from the edges. Advantages of the electromagnetic vibrator are its simple construction, that it stops immediately the electricity is turned off. So, operating it becomes very simple. Cell wheel, a vertically installed rotating wheel that with wings, cells or chambers sitting under a feed hopper may also be used to distribute feed. When the wheel rotates, it transports the feed in the cells. When the cells approach the lowest position, the feed is released. The amount of feed released depends on the number of chambers in the wheel and the speed of rotation. Just after this, I will show you the photograph that will be very easy for you to understand. Rotating disc with a scraper. A rotating disc with a scraper is placed at the bottom of a cylindrical hopper. When the disc rotates, feed will be distributed with the help of the scraper fixed to the hopper. The distance between the rotating disc and the feed hopper regulates the amount of feed that has to be distributed. Conveyor belt system. The rotating belt is placed under the feed container and a distribution bar regulates the thickness of the feed layer on the belt, and by this the amount of feed distributed is also regulated. These are the diagrams of a screw feeder. Here you can see screw feeder. You can see these screws. As they move, the feed comes down. Then we have second, we have vibrating system. Here a vibrator is there. So when plate vibrates, then feed falls down from the edges. C, cell wheel feeder. When feed is there from the hopper, feed gets filled in the cells. That side is open. And when this cell rotates, this wheel rotates, when the cells come down, the feed is, distributed in the pond. And this is conveyor belt. You can understand it. When the belt is rotating, when it comes outside the hopper, the feed comes down. Spreading of feed. On some feeders, a unit of spreading of feed is attached underneath the distribution mechanism. The purpose is to distribute the feed, over a large part of the pond, tank or cage, whatever you are using. 3 spreading patterns are used. Maybe point feeding, where you don't need to spread, sector feeding or circle feeding, depending on your requirement. The sector feeding system normally consists of a vertical rotating plate or brush, whereas a circle feeding technique employs a centrifugal scattering system. These are a pattern of spreading feed that has been shown here. Electrically operated automatic feeders. These feeders consist of three main parts. Electrically operated automatic feeders. What are these three main parts? Feed container, feed distributing, and portioning device. The designs differ from each other in the applied feed distributing device and can be grouped as follows: electromagnet operated with alternative movement, electromotor operated with revolving movement, and vibrator powered. The electric automatic feeders are controlled by a timer with which the length of the feeding time and the time interval between two feedings can be adjusted. This is the photograph of electrically operated automatic feeders, which is shown here. Then we have pneumatic type automatic feeders. These feeders shoot the feed by means of compressed air, spreading it over the water surface. The compressed air supply of the feeders is usually ensured by a central air supplying system, but the feeders can be controlled by a separate electric system centrally or individually, whatever your requirement is. Here you can see that pneumatic type feeder is how it is kept and how it works in distributing the food. Hydraulic type automatic feeders. These feeders can be used on farms where electrical energy supply is not available, but where there is continuous water flow. Some hydraulic feeding systems are known where the water is used not only for driving a mechanical feed distributing device, but for transporting the feed into the fish culturing unit through a pipeline. You can use a pipeline here also. These systems can also be applied for distributing wet food like chopped trash fish. This is one of the major advantages of this system. Then we have technologically advanced feeders depending on the type of fish farm as well as on its investment, financial resources that are available, especially for feeding equipment. There will be several automatic feeders variable for the feeding at any stage of fish farming. Before selecting which feeding system to use, following parameters should be checked carefully. Amount of feed to be delivered to each tank per day. Of course, all these information are fundamental before using any feeder. Total amount of feed that should be delivered to tanks per day at the fish farm. Number of scheduled feeding doses. Dose sizes, minimum and maximum used for fish and shrimp feeding, whatever you are doing. Financial limits on investment for the feeding system. Depending on that also, you will have to choose appropriate type of feeder. Single feeders. The single feeders consist of a silo or hopper and a dosing system. They can work individually or connected to a control panel. Advantages: low cost. They allow continuous dosing. Disadvantages: hoppers are small, so require frequent recharging. You will have to fill it again and again. Only one type of feed can be used, of course. Higher maintenance cost. They have limited software and programming options. These are some of the single feeders that are shown. Moving feeders. When we talk about mobile automated feeders, we mean truck mounted feeding systems. But for this, you need to have your aquaculture system farm like that only, where trucks can move from one part of your pond to the other easily. They have the ideal feeding capacity for large areas with large tanks. Disadvantages: they need a worker for each vehicle. Higher maintenance costs. They have limited software and programming options. These are pictures showing how moving feeders work, but you can see here that we need to have very good facilities and quite large farms utilize this system. Rail feeders. In this type of feeder, the feeding system has silos or dispensers that circulate on a rail previously installed over the tanks at a fish farm. Installed over the tanks at a fish farm. Advantages: it contributes to labor savings. It has centralized software for feeder and feeding management. Disadvantages: it requires initial investment and installation of rails, of course. Silo capacity is limited. The farm should count with more maintenance. Feeding is continuous and with few doses. This is how such kind of rails can be fixed over tanks, and you can operate it for dispensing the food. Drag chain feeders. This feeding system works through pipes with a drag system. Advantages: it has a single feeding line for transporting feed. Disadvantages: it requires initial investment and pipe installation. The maximum drag length is limited. Maintenance is high. So, this is drag chain feeders which are used. Then we have central feeders. In this case, the pneumatic feeding system is located in the center of the farm with pipes connected to each tank. Advantages: it contributes to labor savings. It has centralized software for feeder and feeding management. Multiple silos can be used. This is one of the very good advantages, depending on the type of feed requested for the fish growth. So, it depends on which kind of feed you want to offer. So, the same feeder can be used to feed different life stages or different type of species that you are culturing. It allows to mix feeding pellets. It permits to centralize pellet storage as well as creating random feeding with multiple doses. Low maintenance. Disadvantages: it requires initial investment and pipe installation. This is how central feeders work, how everything is automated here and considered a very good system. Barges for fish feeding in lakes and sea. In order to be able to feed fish in large areas located far from land, centralized feeders are integrated into a barge. They are usually used for feeding cages in sea or lakes. Here you can see that how barges have been used to feed the cages. They are all connected to this. So, that's all in this lecture. Thank you so much.